I've always loved hiking alone. Something about being deep in the woods, away from everything, makes me feel more alive. The silence, the fresh air, the sense of being completely self-reliant. It's something I've never been able to let go of. But after what happened last fall, I don't hike alone anymore. It started as just another trip. I had a long weekend off and wanted to challenge myself. There was a remote trail I'd read about online, barely marked, almost never used, deep in the mountains. No tourists, no crowds, just rough terrain and solitude. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed light but smart. Food, water, extra layers, a small tent, a satellite phone just in case. The trail wasn't supposed to be long, maybe 12 miles round trip, but I planned to take my time, camp overnight, enjoy the quiet, then head back in the morning. I drove up early, reaching the trailhead just as the sun was coming up. There was no parking lot, no signs, just a narrow dirt road that ended in a clearing. My truck was the only vehicle there. Perfect. I checked my gear, locked up, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The trail was overgrown, but I could still make it out, narrow, winding, cutting through thick trees. Sunlight filtered through the branches. Birds called in the distance. It was peaceful. As I got deeper in, the path became harder to follow. There were fallen trees, patches of thick brush, sections where it seemed to disappear completely. I had to backtrack a couple of times, scanning for any sign of where to go next. Around midday, I stopped to eat. I sat on a flat rock overlooking a steep drop into the valley below, listening to the wind move through the trees. That's when I noticed the first thing that felt off. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. Felt like the woods were listening. I shook it off, finished eating, and kept moving. By late afternoon, I was deep in the mountains. The trail was barely a trail anymore, just a vague path through thick trees. I hadn't seen any markers in hours. I was starting to think I had gone the wrong way when I found something strange. A boot, old, weathered, lying just off the path. I stopped, staring at it. It looked like it had been there a long time. The leather cracked, the sole peeling away. There was no sign of another one. No footprints, just one boot. I felt uneasy, but I kept moving. Another hour passed, and I found something worse. A backpack. It was torn, half buried under leaves. The zippers were broken, the fabric shredded. Animals, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was getting late. I needed to set up camp. I found a flat spot near a cluster of trees and got my tent up quickly. As I gathered wood for a fire, I kept thinking about the backpack, about how there was no sign of its owner. By the time the fire was going, the sun was almost gone. The forest stretched out around me, dark and silent. That's when I saw the shape, just beyond the trees, barely visible in the dim light. First, I thought it was a person, but as I squinted, trying to make out details, I realized it wasn't moving. A tree stump, I told myself, just a shadow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been there before. I ate quickly, put out the fire, and got into my tent. I barely slept. I woke up sometime in the night. Something had woken me. I lay still, listening. The fire was out, the forest dark. Then I heard it. Soft, slow, footsteps. Not an animal. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the skittering of a raccoon. These were deliberate, human. They circled my tent. My heart pounded. I reached for my knife, gripping it so tight my fingers ached. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Minutes passed. I strained to hear anything. Breathing, movement. Nothing. I didn't sleep again. As soon as the sun rose, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The ground was covered in leaves, undisturbed. No footprints. No signs that anyone had been there. I packed up fast. I didn't care about finishing the hike. I just wanted to get out. I started back the way I came, moving quickly. But something was wrong. The trail was different. I was following my own footprints from the day before, but the trees looked wrong, like the landscape had shifted. I kept moving, telling myself I was just shaken from the night. But then I saw something that stopped me cold. Another boot. The same boot. I had looped back to the same spot. I had been walking for nearly 2 hours. I wasn't going the right way. Panic crept in. I took out my map, my compass. I wasn't lost. Couldn't be. I had been following my own tracks. I forced myself to stay calm. I adjusted my course, heading where I knew the road was. An hour passed, then 2. Then I saw the backpack again. The same one, torn, half buried. I had been walking in circles. My chest tightened. I checked my GPS. The screen flickered, showing a blank map. The battery was dead. Impossible. I had charged it before I left. It was supposed to last for days. I started moving faster. The sun was getting lower, the trees casting long shadows. Then I heard it, a rustling sound, not the wind, something moving through the trees, following me. I didn't stop to look. I just ran. I don't know how long I ran. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop until I burst into a clearing. And there it was, my truck. I had made it back, but something was wrong. The driver's side door was open. I knew I had locked it. I stood there, gasping for air, staring at the open door. The inside was untouched. No sign of anyone. I didn't care. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Gravel sprayed as I peeled out of there, speeding down the dirt road without looking back. I don't know what happened in those woods. I don't know why I kept going in circles. I don't know who or what was walking around my tent. I just know I was being watched. I never went back, never tried to figure it out, and I never hike alone anymore. I don't know when exactly things started to go wrong. Maybe it was before I even set foot on the trail. Maybe it was the moment I ignored that uneasy feeling in my gut, the quiet warning at the back of my mind telling me to turn around. But I didn't. I had planned this trip for weeks. A solo, 3-day hike through a stretch of remote wilderness in Montana. A challenge, but nothing beyond my experience. I had done longer hikes, harder ones. I had planned carefully, packed all the right gear, checked the weather. Everything should have gone smoothly. Didn't. I parked my truck at the trailhead just after sunrise. There were no other cars, which wasn't surprising. This trail wasn't popular. That was part of the appeal. It cut through dense forest, then climbed into rocky hills before looping back toward the river valley. I shouldered my pack, locked the truck, and started walking. The first few miles were peaceful. The air was cool, the forest quiet except for birds and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding between towering pines. I settled into a rhythm, my boots crunching over damp earth, the weight of my pack familiar on my shoulders. I made good time, covering nearly 10 miles before stopping for lunch near a small creek. I felt good, but that quiet warning in my gut never went away. By late afternoon, I reached the base of the hills. The trees thinned out here, giving way to rocky slopes and tall, dry grass. I picked a flat spot near a boulder and set up camp. I cooked a quick meal, stretched out my legs, and watched the sun dip below the trees. The sky turned soft shades of orange and pink. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off. I couldn't explain it, just a wrongness in the air. I brushed it off as nerves. I was alone, miles from anyone. My brain was playing tricks on me. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and told myself everything was fine. I fell asleep fast. I woke up even faster. The first night, the whistling. A sound pulled me from sleep. Soft, subtle, whistling. Not the wind, not an animal, person. A slow, quiet whistle, drifting through the trees. I held my breath. The sound wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Somewhere down the slope, hidden in the darkness. I checked my watch. 2:43 a.m. I listened, my pulse hammering in my ears. The whistling continued for a few minutes. Then it stopped. Silence. I lay there, staring at the roof of my tent, waiting. Nothing. Eventually, I fell asleep again. Day 2. Something is wrong. I told myself I imagined it. That morning, I packed up, tightened my boots, and kept moving. The trail got steeper, winding through rocky outcrops. The air was thinner up here, the sun hotter. I tried to focus on the hike, on my footing, on my breathing, but the feeling wouldn't leave, that sense of being watched. By midday, I reached the highest point of the trail, a flat ridge with a view of endless forest below. I sat down, ate a protein bar, and let myself relax for a moment. Then I saw them, far below, near the tree line, two figures, standing still, too far to make out any details, but close enough that I knew they were watching me. A jolt of fear shot through me. Hikers? Hunters? Something else? I stared for a long time, waiting for them to move. They didn't. I stood, adjusted my pack, and started down the other side of the ridge. I forced myself not to look back. By the time I reached the valley, the sun was low. I found a clearing near a small stream and set up camp. I tried to eat, but my stomach was tight. Something was wrong. I crawled into my tent early, knife within reach. I didn't expect to sleep. I was right. The second night, the footsteps. The sound came just after midnight. Not whistling this time. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Circling my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps were soft, careful. Like someone trying not to wake me. They stopped near my head. I gripped my knife so hard my hand ached. Then nothing. No retreating footsteps. Just silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night. Day 3, the descent. I packed up at first light, moving fast. My whole body felt tight with tension, like a wire pulled too hard. I had to get back to the truck. The trail twisted through dense forest now, thick with undergrowth. Every few minutes, I checked over my shoulder. Nothing, but the feeling wouldn't go away. By late afternoon, I was 5 miles from the trailhead. Then I saw it. Footprints. On the trail ahead of me, bare feet, deep in the mud. They hadn't been there before. My mouth went dry. I picked up my pace, my heart pounding. The trees pressed in on either side, the shadows stretching long. Then, just as I rounded a bend, a figure, standing in the middle of the trail, not moving, not speaking, just standing there, watching me. The sinking sun was behind them, casting their face in shadow. I stopped cold. My brain screamed run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then they took a step forward. Something in me snapped. I've always been the kind of person who prefers to be alone in the woods. There's something about being deep in nature that makes the world feel right. No distractions, no noise from civilization. Just me, my backpack, and miles of unspoiled land. That's why I planned this solo hiking trip. A full week, deep in the forests of northern Michigan. This wasn't my first time hiking alone, and I didn't see any reason why it would be different from my other trips. I had my gear, my maps, plenty of supplies. I knew the risks. Bears, wolves, even the occasional cougar. But I was experienced enough to handle myself. At least that's what I thought. The first few days were peaceful. The trail was rough, barely maintained, which was exactly what I wanted. No tourists, no crowds, just endless forest stretching in every direction. The air was crisp, cool, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. On the third day, things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. The forest got quieter. Normally, I'd hear birds, the rustling of squirrels in the underbrush, the distant calls of crows. But now there was nothing, just an eerie, unnatural silence. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe I had just wandered into an area where the wildlife wasn't as active. But as I kept hiking, I noticed something else, the feeling of being watched. It started as a slight unease, a prickle on the back of my neck. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. But the trail was empty. Then I saw the tracks. At first, I thought they belonged to a bear. They were big, deep in the mud, spaced far apart. But as I crouched down to look closer, my stomach tightened. They weren't bear tracks. They were shaped almost like a human foot, but longer, wider, with deep claw marks extending from the toes. And they weren't old, the edges were sharp, fresh. I scanned the woods around me, suddenly feeling exposed. The trees loomed tall, their dense branches blocking out most of the sky. The underbrush was thick, shadowed. If something was out there, watching me, I wouldn't see it until it wanted me to. I stood up, forcing myself to move forward. My gut told me to turn back, but I was already too deep into the forest. Going back meant another 3 days of hiking in the same direction I had come from. Pushing forward meant I could reach a service road in 2. I chose the faster route. That night, I set up camp near a small stream. The sound of running water was comforting, drowning out the silence of the woods. I built a fire, made a quick meal, and sat watching the flames. Then I heard it, a low growl. It was distant, barely audible over the crackling fire, but it was there, a deep, guttural sound, too low to be a coyote, too powerful to be anything small. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the trees. Nothing, just darkness and endless forest. I told myself it was just my imagination, the wind playing tricks on me. But I kept my knife close as I crawled into my tent. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made my heart race. The wind through the branches, the creak of trees shifting. It all felt wrong. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard footsteps. Heavy, slow, circling my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I gripped my knife, my body frozen. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting, listening. But eventually, the exhaustion won. My eyes shut, my body too drained to fight sleep any longer. By morning, I was packed and moving before the sun had fully risen. My body ached. My mind felt sluggish from the lack of rest. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of those woods. But the tracks followed me. Every so often, I'd glance down at the dirt path, and there they were, deep impressions in the mud, always fresh, always just behind where I had walked. I wasn't alone. By midday, I stopped to rest near a rocky outcrop. I was exhausted, my legs burning from the constant movement. I sat on a fallen log, drinking from my water bottle, trying to steady my nerves. Then I caught a whiff of something foul. Wet fur, rotting meat. The smell hit me like a punch to the gut, thick and heavy in the still air. My stomach churned. Then I saw it. First, I thought it was a tree, a dark shape, standing between the trunks, motionless. But as my eyes adjusted, my blood ran cold. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, its limbs long and muscular. But what froze me in place was the head. It looked like a dog, not like a normal dog. Its snout was longer, its ears pointed, its eyes reflecting the light in an unnatural way, and it was staring right at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it took a step forward. That was all I needed. I grabbed my pack and ran. I sprinted down the trail, my heart hammering, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I heard it move. Fast, too fast. Branches snapped, leaves rustled. Heavy footfalls crashed through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. The The trail blurred beneath me, my body running on pure adrenaline. My only thought was get to the service road. Get out. I don't know how long I ran. Felt like forever. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. Then up ahead I saw it. The road, a strip of dirt and gravel cutting through the forest. Safety. I forced myself to move faster, ignoring the pain, ignoring the sound of something massive closing in behind me. I hit the road, nearly collapsing as my legs gave out. My hands hit the gravel, my breath coming in choking gasps. Silence. I turned, expecting to see the thing burst from the trees. But the forest was empty. It wasn't chasing me anymore. I waited, my body trembling. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Whatever it was, it had let me go. I walked until I found another hiker with a truck. He gave me a ride back to town, barely asking any questions. Maybe he saw the look on my face, the raw panic in my eyes. I never told anyone what I saw, but I don't hike alone anymore, and I never go back to those woods, because I know what's out there, and I know it's still watching. I've spent a lot of time trying to convince myself that what happened wasn't real. I tell myself I was tired, my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was dehydrated. Maybe I was just paranoid from being alone too long. But deep down, I know better. It was real, and I still don't know how I survived. I've always preferred hiking alone. I don't like the chatter of other people ruining the quiet of the woods, and I hate waiting on slow hikers or pushing to keep up with fast ones. Alone, I can go at my own pace, take breaks when I want, and enjoy the wilderness without distractions. That's why I planned this trip. 5 days, deep in the forests of Washington state. Not the well-traveled trails. This was real wilderness, miles from anyone, with no cell service, no roads, nothing but trees, mountains, and the occasional animal. The first 2 days were exactly what I wanted. I hiked deep into the forest, further than most people would ever go. The air was crisp, the trees stretched high above me, and the sound of the wind moving through the leaves was the only noise around. I set up camp near a small stream, cooked a simple meal over my camp stove, and fell asleep under the stars. But on the third day, things started to change. I woke up early, packed my gear, and started hiking. The trail was rough, barely more than an old animal path, but I liked it that way. Felt untouched, wild. By mid-morning, I came across something that made me stop. Tracks. Big ones. At first, I thought they belonged to a bear. They were deep in the dirt, spaced far apart, meaning whatever left them was heavy. But the shape was wrong. Bears have wide, rounded paws, and these tracks looked different. More like a human foot, but much bigger. And the toes were long, tipped with deep grooves, like claw marks. I crouched down, touching the edge of one print. The dirt was still soft, fresh. A chill ran through me, but I pushed it away. Maybe it was just a weird bear track. Maybe my mind was making it seem stranger than it was. I stood up, adjusted my pack, and kept walking. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest felt different, too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds, insects, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. But now there was nothing, just silence, and the feeling of being watched. That night, I set up camp near a ridge, giving me a clear view of the valley below. I made a small fire, ate quickly, and sat listening to the woods around me. Then, just as the last light of day faded, I heard it, a howl, long, low, rising in pitch before cutting off sharply. It was far away, but something about it made my skin crawl. I've heard wolves before, and this wasn't a wolf. It was deeper, more guttural, almost human. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then it came again, closer. I barely slept that night. Every little noise made my heart pound. The crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves. Every sound felt like it was something coming for me. By morning, I was exhausted, but I packed up quickly and started hiking again. I needed to get out of that area. But as I moved, I saw more tracks, and this time they followed mine. By midday, I knew something was wrong. Every time I stopped, I heard movement behind me. Not constant, just enough to let me know it was there, stalking me. I picked up the pace, my pulse pounding in my ears. The trail was getting steeper, climbing up into the mountains, and I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A deer carcass. It was torn apart, blood soaking the dirt. The ribs were exposed, flesh stripped away. But what scared me most was how fresh it was. The blood was still wet, and the way it was killed, this wasn't a normal predator. The cuts were too deep, too clean, like something with massive claws had ripped it open in seconds. Then I smelled it. A foul, musky odor, thick and rotten, like wet fur and decay. I wasn't alone. I took off, practically running up the trail. I didn't care about the weight of my pack. Didn't care if I twisted an ankle on the uneven ground. I just needed to get away. But the thing behind me didn't let up. I could hear it moving now, branches snapping, heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. It was fast, faster than anything that big should be. Then I heard the breathing, deep, ragged, just behind me. I ran harder. The trees thinned ahead, and I saw it. A cabin. I didn't think. I sprinted for the door, slammed into it, and threw it open. Inside, it was dark, empty, abandoned. Dust covered everything, old furniture sat rotting in the corners. I shoved the door closed and locked it, then pushed a heavy table against it. My chest heaved, my entire body shaking. Then the thing outside screamed. It wasn't a howl. It was a horrible, rage-filled sound, something between an animal and a man. It shook the walls of the cabin, made my bones feel like they would crack. Then it hit the door. The wood splintered, the entire cabin shaking under the force. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a rusted fire poker, and held it in trembling hands. Another slam. The door cracked. I backed away, heart hammering so hard I thought it would explode. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the attack stopped. Silence. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the darkness, gripping the fire poker, listening. At some point, the sky began to lighten. Morning. I moved slowly, listening for any sign of the creature. Nothing. I took my chance. I pushed the table aside, eased the door open, and stepped outside. The forest was silent. No birds, no wind, just empty stillness. I didn't waste time. I ran. I don't remember much of the hike back. I moved fast, barely stopping to drink water, ignoring the burning in my legs that I expected it to come after me. I expected to hear those footsteps, that breathing, but the woods stayed quiet. By the time I reached my truck, I was shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. But I started the engine, tore out of there, and didn't look back. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. I only know one thing. I wasn't supposed to leave those woods alive, but somehow I did, and I will never, ever go back. I don't go into the woods anymore. I used to love it. The quiet, the isolation, the sense of being completely disconnected from the rest of the world. But after what happened, I can't even step near the tree line without feeling my chest tighten, because I know what's out there, and I know it's waiting. I planned the hike months in advance. A full week, deep in the forests of Montana, far from any roads or towns. The kind of place where you can walk for days and never see another person. I had done solo trips before, but nothing this remote. That was the appeal. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wilderness. The first few days were perfect. The trail was rough, but I liked that. It made it feel like I was really out in the wild. The weather was good, the air crisp, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. By the third day, I was deep into the mountains. The trees stretched high above me, dense and endless. There was no cell service, no signs of other hikers, nothing but pure, untouched nature. But that's when things started to feel wrong. It was small at first, just a feeling, a prickling on the back of my neck like I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination. When you're alone for days, your mind plays tricks on you. Every rustling branch feels like something creeping up behind you. Every distant noise makes your heart jump. But then I found the deer, or what was left of it. I was following the trail when I caught the smell. Rotting flesh. I thought maybe it was a dead animal, something that had just died of natural causes. But as I got closer, I knew that wasn't the case. The deer had been ripped apart. Not eaten, ripped apart. Its body was shredded, deep gashes running down its sides. Its ribs cracked open like something had torn them apart with its bare hands. That's what made it strange. Predators kill to eat. Wolves, bears, they take what they need. They don't tear an animal open and just leave it there to rot. The ground around the carcass was torn up, deep claw marks raking through the dirt. The smell of blood was thick, heavy in the air. I felt sick. I forced myself to move past it, to keep hiking. But that feeling that I wasn't alone only got worse. That night, I set up camp near a rocky outcrop, high enough to see the valley below. I built a fire, ate a quick meal, and sat listening to the forest. That's when I heard it. Not a howl, not the distant cry of a wolf. Breathing, deep, slow, close. I froze. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the trees. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the flames. Nothing, but I knew something was out there. I could feel it. The breathing was steady, measured. Like whatever it wasn't scared of me. It was watching me. I grabbed my knife, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a bear. But bears make noise. They shuffle, they move. This thing was silent. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back to a rock, my knife gripped in my hand, my eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the fire. By morning, whatever had been out there was gone. But the tracks weren't. I almost didn't see them at first. They were pressed deep into the dirt, just at the edge of my campsite. Huge, larger than any footprint I had ever seen. Longer than a man's, but wider. The toes tipped with deep, curved claw marks. And they were fresh. They hadn't been there when I set up camp. Something had stood there, watching me, just beyond the firelight. I packed up quickly. My whole body was tense, my mind screaming at me to move. I wasn't alone out there, and whatever was with me wasn't afraid. I hiked fast, my legs burning as I pushed myself forward. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my ears straining for any sound. The forest was too quiet.
No birds.
No wind. Nothing but the crunch of my boots on the trail. By midday, I stopped to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. I had never felt like this before. Not even when I'd run into bears in the past. Because this wasn't like that. A bear doesn't stalk you. Then I saw it. First, I thought it was just a shadow. A dark shape between the trees, still as a statue. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was standing, tall, too tall. Its body was covered in dark fur, thick and matted. Its limbs were long, muscular, its hands, hanging down past its knees. But the head was the worst part. It looked like a wolf, but wrong. The snout was too long, the ears too pointed. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, locked onto me. Then it moved. Fast. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The only thing I could focus on was moving, my feet slamming against the dirt path, my lungs burning. Behind me, I heard it crashing through the underbrush, not running, bounding, covering way more ground than I was. I was losing. Then up ahead, I saw it, a break in the trees. The road. I pushed myself harder, my vision tunneling, every muscle in my body screaming. I hit the road just as something slammed into the trees behind me. I turned, expecting to see it burst through the underbrush, but it didn't. The forest was still, silent, but I knew it was there, watching, waiting. I made it back to my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I didn't look back. I drove until I hit town, until I was surrounded by streetlights and people and safety. I never reported it. Who would believe me? But I haven't been back. I don't go into the woods anymore, because I know what's out there, and I know it's still waiting. I had always loved hiking alone. There was something peaceful about being deep in the woods with no one around. No cars, no voices, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crunch of leaves under my boots. It made me feel alive. It reminded me how small I was in the grand scheme of things. That's why I set out on a 3-day solo hike through the remote wilderness of northern Montana. I had done similar trips before, but this one felt different. The trail was an old one, barely maintained, and I hadn't seen a single person since I parked my truck at the trailhead. That was exactly what I wanted. The first day was easy. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with clear skies stretching endlessly above me. I hiked for miles without stopping, the towering pines surrounding me like silent guardians. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a river and decided to set up camp. The air smelled crisp, fresh, untouched. It was perfect. I ate a quick dinner, watched the sunset bleed orange and pink across the sky, then crawled into my tent. Sleep came fast, my body exhausted from the long hike. But in the middle of the night, something woke me. A sound, a low, distant howl. At first, I thought it was a coyote, but this howl was deeper, stronger. It carried through the trees like a warning, sending a chill up my spine. Wolves weren't common in this area, but they weren't unheard of either. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. Silence. Then another howl, closer this time. I grabbed my knife from my pack, just in case, and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I packed up and continued hiking deeper into the wilderness. The trail became rougher, less defined. The trees grew taller, their thick branches blotting out the sun. Something felt off. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just silence. That's when I noticed the tracks. At first, I thought they belonged to a bear. They were massive, deep in the damp earth. But as I looked closer, my stomach turned. These weren't bear tracks. They were shaped more like a man's foot, except too large, too wide, with claw marks digging into the dirt. I tried to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. Maybe someone had been out here before me. Maybe they were wearing strange boots. Maybe I was overthinking it. But as the day wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. But the woods remained empty. That night, I set up camp near a rocky outcrop, hoping the high ground would give me some sense of security. I built a fire, ate my meal, and sat staring into the flames. The silence pressed in around me like a weight. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The howl. This time, it was closer, much closer. My blood ran cold. I reached for my knife, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The howl was followed by movement. Branches snapping, heavy footsteps circling my camp. Whatever was out there, it wasn't afraid of me. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness and endless forest. But the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. Then, for the first time, I saw it. A pair of eyes reflecting the light just beyond the tree line. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. My breath caught in my throat. Couldn't move. Then the eyes disappeared. The next few hours were hell. I didn't sleep. I kept my knife in one hand, my flashlight in the other, listening. The footsteps came and went, sometimes close, sometimes far. But the worst part was the breathing. Deep, guttural breathing, just beyond my tent. I waited for dawn like a dying man waiting for rescue. When the sky finally turned gray with morning light, I packed up and left, moving faster than I ever had in my life. But the feeling of being watched never left me. The tracks followed me. I found them in the mud, in the soft earth near the river, always just behind me. By late afternoon, I knew I wouldn't make it back to my truck before nightfall. My only option was to keep moving and hope to find shelter. That's when I stumbled upon the cabin. It was old, abandoned, barely standing. The door hung crooked on its hinges, the windows shattered. But it was better than nothing. I rushed inside, barricading the door with a broken chair and whatever else I could find. As the sun set, The woods outside grew darker than I had ever seen. Then the howling started again. This time it wasn't distant. It was right outside. I gripped my knife, backing into the corner of the cabin. Heavy footsteps crunched the dead leaves outside. Then something slammed against the door, shaking the entire structure. My breath came in short gasps. Another slam. The wood cracked. I was going to die. Then silence. For minutes, maybe hours, I stood frozen, listening. The footsteps retreated. The breathing faded. And then nothing. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just waited, gripping my knife until my fingers went numb. First light, I ran. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did. The forest felt endless. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. But I kept moving, forcing my legs to keep going, ignoring the burning in my lungs. When I finally saw my truck, I nearly collapsed. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I saw it one last time, standing at the tree line, watching, tall, muscular, covered in thick, dark fur. His eyes locked onto mine, and then it turned and vanished into the woods. I never went back. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't hike in remote places, and I never, ever ignore that feeling of being watched. Because sometimes you're not alone in the woods. Sometimes something is watching, and if you're lucky, it lets you leave. I've always loved hiking alone. Something about the quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being completely disconnected from everything. It always felt like freedom. People warned me about the risks, but I wasn't reckless. I knew how to navigate, how to read the weather, how to handle myself in the wild. This trip was supposed to be like any other. A solo overnight hike in a remote part of the mountains, a place far from roads and crowds. I had done my research, checked the maps, the terrain, the weather forecast. I packed light but smart. Enough food, water, a sturdy tent, a solid knife. I even let someone know my plans, just in case. The trail was about 15 miles round trip, winding through thick forest before opening up to a high-altitude lake where I planned to camp. No cell service, no marked campsites, just wilderness. Exactly how I liked it. The first few miles were easy. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick in the air. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the ground in shifting patches of gold. The sound of my boots crunching against the dirt mixed with the distant rush of a stream felt perfect. But somewhere around mile 5, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things. The woods were too quiet. I had been hearing birds all morning, warblers, jays, the occasional cry of a hawk. But now, nothing. No rustling in the underbrush, no squirrels darting through the trees, just the wind pushing through the branches. And the smell. At first, I thought I imagined it. Faint, almost unnoticeable. A damp, sour scent, like something old and rotting. It would come and go with the wind, just strong enough to make my stomach tighten. I kept walking. A mile later, I found the first sign that something wasn't right. A tree stripped of its bark. Not just in patches, completely bare, the wood beneath pale and raw. The exposed surface was covered in long, deep gouges, like something had scraped its way down over and over. I stopped, staring at it. Bears did that sometimes, right? Marking their territory, sharpening their claws. But something about this felt wrong. The marks were too deep, too wide, and the ground around the tree, the dirt was disturbed. Not footprints exactly, just drag marks, like something heavy had been pulled through. I swallowed hard, adjusted my pack, and moved on. The feeling of unease didn't go away. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was already lowering. The water stretched out in front of me, smooth and dark, surrounded by thick trees. It should have been beautiful, but it wasn't. The smell was stronger here, and the silence, complete. I hesitated. Every instinct in my body told me to turn around, to leave. But I was tired, and the sun was getting low. I forced myself to go through the motions, set up my tent, gather wood, get a fire going. Normal things, routine things, but my skin felt too tight, my breath too loud. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent, staring at the fabric, listening. I don't know how long I stayed like that, my knife clutched tight in my hand, my body tense. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A sound I had never heard before. Not an animal, not the wind. A low, wet breathing. Slow, raspy, close. I froze. My fingers tightened around the knife. The breathing stopped. Silence. Then, a sound outside. Not footsteps. Not an animal moving through the brush. A dragging noise. Something heavy pulling across the ground. The fire outside had burned low, casting faint light through the thin fabric of my tent. And then, a shadow moved across it. Tall. Too tall. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. The shadow stayed, just beyond the thin fabric. Then slowly it crouched. I clenched my teeth so hard my jaw ached. My mind screamed at me to run, to move, to do something, but I couldn't. It stayed there for what felt like hours. Then, just as slow, it moved away. The dragging sound faded. The breathing disappeared. I stayed frozen in my tent, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. An hour. I don't know when I finally worked up the courage to move, but as soon as I did, I acted fast. I didn't bother packing. Didn't try to be quiet. I ran. I grabbed my pack, my knife, and I ran. The woods were still dark, the trail barely visible in the faint glow of dawn. I didn't stop. Not when I tripped. Not when branches whipped against my face. Not when I heard something moving behind me. A wet, dragging sound. Getting closer. I ran faster. I didn't look back. By the time I reached my car, the sun was breaking over the trees. I threw my pack inside, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I backed out so fast the tires spun against the dirt. I didn't breathe again until I was miles away. Even now, I don't know what I saw. I don't know if it was real, if my mind twisted shadows into something worse. But I do know one thing. Something was out there, and it was watching me.